This is the wild, wild west, brewing. A different product, it's a different mindset, it's a different safety standards, because it is different than beer. Brewers get ready to have a lot of fun the next few years, getting creative and learning more food safety practices that we may not have been accustomed to. Now we have to go back to the biological drawing board of nature and find yeasts that are not able to consume maltose, and of them make something that tastes like
Welcome to the show. I am in Asheville, North Carolina. Love coming to Asheville. There's all kind of great things going on. And actually, White Labs is one of my favorite places to go eat and grab a beer. And I'm here today with Chris White, none other, the founder and owner of White Labs and their international things. But, Chris, we're going to be talking about NA beers. And we've got a great one here that I've never tried, and I think I understand you've not tried yet either.
I have not tried it. Beautiful packaging, and I'm excited to try it.
Sierra Nevada's Trail Pass IPA. Oh, that's nice.
Fabulous. That is great. That is
so nice.
Great. Yes.
And I don't detect any wordiness at all.
It's fabulous.
Wow. Well, Sierra Nevada, cheers. This is one awesome beer. I'm going to enjoy this guy one more time. Well, Chris, while I expect us to spend most of our time talking about the yeast themselves, because, look where we are, I wish you would tell us a little bit more that if somebody's going to tackle an NA beer, what are some of the most essential things that you know of right now?
Well, thank you. I know I've been drinking a lot of NA beers this year, and it's sort of interesting because been working on NA yeast for a long time. We're making them here at White Labs. This is even part of a tour that people can come on, but I wasn't really interested in drinking them. But about a year ago, just before Dry January a year ago, my identical twin brother Mike White, that works at White Labs too, I said he's going to do it and he's going to drink NA beers. Well, he never stopped. He's been exclusively drinking NA beers for a year, over a year now, and he's been feeling great. And so I've drank a lot of NA beers with him. I always have them in my fridge now. And we've noticed in this last year the increase in availability. A year ago, walk into a tap room, may I get an NA beer? And the answer was often no. And there's less no's now. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important for our industry. And so I'm just excited to see another new entry from a well-established craft brewery.
Oh, yeah.
Home brewers are interested in it too. I'm a little surprised how popular it's gotten in the United States, because we started working with it well over 5 years ago because of White Labs Copenhagen and the interest in NA beers in Europe.
Oh, wow.
And there was already established low alcohol categories in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. There's regulatory aspects, and Germany requiring an NA beer to be available. And so that doesn't really exist in the US. There wasn't a big interest in low alcohol beers or session beers before. There's not a regulatory side to it, so except drinking and driving, of course. But younger people are driving a renewed interest in a new kind of NA beers, not the old malty sweet things, but well-made craft beers.
Are there like 3 or 4 things that you as a yeast expert and microbiologist, because we're into something that's sort of food grade, right?
Yes.
Which is a real mind shift, sort of minimum when a brewer is considering brewing their first NA beer or early in the stages of their NA. What are some tips or lines that you won't cross?
Yes, that's a good point, because there's a reason Sierra Nevada took so long to come out with this beer, because they're taking these parameters I'm going to talk about, plus others probably, very seriously. And Samuel Adams as well. I was just in their Cincinnati brewery, and I had it last week, and it was great.
It is great.
It's in my fridge too, at home. But and they also went through this process. And I think all small breweries and home brewers should think about what's important, because it is different than beer. Just like seltzer is different than beer. When brewers started making seltzer, it's like, oh, the fermentations aren't working. Well, that was a nutrient thing. Yeast need more than just sugar and water. And so brewers learned how to make that. Now this gets into a food safety aspect, even though all the non-alcohol things we're making are really more under FDA. And beer's under FDA, but they just don't regulate it as much because of beer. The pH requirement. A lot of brewers don't know that the pH requirement even for beer is 4.6 and below. So if you're over 4.6, you're out of compliance. And when you're shielded under the beer spectrum, some of these dry hop beers get higher than that. It doesn't really get seen, but it's still not something we should do. But this is something that's get more under the FDA like watch umbrella from a labeling standpoint to a safety standpoint, and that pH is going to be really, really critical to stay below 4.6 and go as low as you can, that you like the flavor. When you do your boil, and we're going to talk about, I think, the process a little bit, just remember, you're not killing everything. There's sterilization, which is autoclave, and there's boil. So spores live through a boil. We don't have to really worry about that in beer with the fermentation, the lack of oxygen, and the ethanol created. Now, you're not going to get ethanol in here, so that allows, and it's been proven in experiments, that pathogens can survive in a non-alcohol beer, where they can not in an alcohol beer. So that really makes the third thing most important to pasteurize. And you can do that at home. This is not beer, so remove your thinking about pasteurization, and it does affect flavor, but that is the best way to make sure it's safe.
This one is pasteurized. I know that. And it's fabulous.
I'm not surprised, because they would take that safety very seriously.
Oh, they do. Then they pasteurize. I know that for a fact. I've talked to the brewers. So I don't know that there are any exceptions out there. Please put in the comments if you know of a beer, NA beer packaging that is done without pasteurization. But as far as I know, they're all looking to pasteurization.
Good.
So those are the essentials, pH and pasteurization and your mash temperatures. And those are some of the most critical things. And of course, the yeast.
Yes, yeah.
Touch on the yeast before we move in, because you've got a recipe there that I want you to share. But at the very basics, I even brought a package of Lallemand yeast. This is their British ale yeast that I understand is maltose negative and lends itself to NA beers. We'll find out how well. I have one in my fermenter right now. But if you were looking for yeasts, what would you look for, Chris?
Well, yeah, we're obviously focusing on the yeast side. There's other ways to remove alcohol after it's made, but those are the more traditional ways and require equipment. If you can just use a different microbe and a slightly different process, that's sort of easier for everybody. So we worked with 3 yeast strains that are maltose negative, WLP 618, Saccharomycosis ludwigi, which is what we have chosen to release as NA all-day yeast strain. So that's the one we make every day. WLP 603, Tolospora delbrueckii, and then WLP 686, Zygosaccharomyces lentis. And we chose.
I don't have to know these names, do I, if I order it?
Right. Those names are, just like saying Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the yeast that we use in brewing. So there's more strains within those, right? So that's why when we released WLP 618, we called it NA all day yeast. And it's the most consistent fermentations. It's the one we've had the most experience with. But the other 2 strains we do make for breweries too, and they also work well. But you have to treat things differently because most of the fermentation sugars we have worked with have been maltose as brewers.
Yes.
50% or so of that carbohydrate is maltose. And brewer's yeast has gotten really good at consuming maltose, but that turns into ethanol. So you want to find, we found yeast strains, and there's others, and other companies have others, and there'll be more in the future, and there'll be probably GMO options. But you just got to keep that part of the conversation because if you use a GMO yeast, it may not be a beer you can sell in a certain other country like Australia or New Zealand. But there may be other ways to make them too.
Well, you've got a recipe there. Can we go through that recipe and why you chose the ingredients and mash temperatures and those kind of things? Because it's a little different. You got to look at the whole brew day a bit different, don't you?
Right. So this is a non-alcoholic session IPA recipe we have on our website. And we first brewed this a little earlier than 2022, but I was invited to the National Homebrew Conference in Australia in 2022, and they asked me to talk about NA beer.
In Australia?
In Australia.
No kidding.
So one of the home brewers there, maybe some of your listeners, made the beer on this recipe, but we modified it since then based on some of that experience and other brewers' experiences. So that was excellent to have a tasting there while I was able to give my when I gave my talk in Melbourne. So we've got pale malt as the main malt, white wheat, flaked oats, and carafoam. It's important to mash higher, and people are even talking about higher than this, but our recipe 169 Fahrenheit, 76 C, making longer dextrins.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these yeast aren't going to consume maltose, but you know what, minimize it anyway, and the longer dextrins are going to give you more mouthfeel and a better body and foam.
Okay.
So it's that's something, a mash temperature probably nobody's mashed at before, because
Not intentionally.
normal fermentation wouldn't go very well.
Some of us
if you
have
don't much
unintentionally.
maltose. Yeah, right. So that part's normal. We can measure temperatures on any size brewery. But the next part is adjusting your pH. And we say to adjust it to 4.6. You've had experience doing that even lower.
That was a little unintentional. I overshot my 4.6.
Okay.
And I found out that's a little touch and go too. You really got to be careful. It's not exactly proportional.
Right. So not every home brewer or small brewery even has a pH meter. We all have thermometers, but a lot of us don't have pH meters, and that should change anyway. I really think everybody should measure their pH of their beer before fermentation. And that's part of the record keeping, and that allows you to track the fermentation too, to make sure, you're usually starting around 5.5 after a mash, and then you're ending around 4.5 after fermentation, but you might dry hop, which can raise the pH, and really knowing that you're under 4.6 at brewery at any level, I think is important. So we should all be doing that anyway. But with NA, it's important because you're not going to have a big active fermentation, so you can't start at 5.5.
Right.
It's just going to go to 4.2, 5.2 or something, right? Or a little bit. So you really need to bring that down to 4.6.
You're kind of helping the yeast, right?
Yes.
But, yeah.
It's just best to do it then.
Lactic acid, is that what your recipe calls for?
We have food grade lactic acid is great. In our recipe, we say add food grade phosphoric acid, but either will work.
What do you recommend from a taste point of view?
That's why I think people choose different things, but we have a phosphoric acid in the recipe because we think that tastes better.
Okay. But what do you personally like?
Phosphoric acid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I hear most people talking lactic acid, so maybe that's more available.
Probably. Yeah.
But you're going to use a fair amount of it, so think about that flavor impact. So that's why we put phosphoric acid here. Since it's an IPA, it's kind of interesting that we call it a session IPA because
kind
it's
of oxymoron.
non-alcoholic. So this is the wild west, brewing. We are just learning what to name things. People are using the term zero and other things, and it's going to look different in a few years too because it's going to keep growing for a few years. We used Amarillo hops and Citra in the boil for 5 minutes and whirlpool for 45 minutes with the Citra. People are going to wonder, can you dry hop these beers? I don't know what Sierra Nevada did here, but I would say no, because even if you're pasteurizing, maybe it's okay in the can or in the bottle, but I'm sure the answer is going to be yes soon because people are going to keep working on dry hopping. That's what our industry wants to do. But you're also that'll raise the pH a little bit, and you got to think about that.
Okay.
And you're adding non-boiled things to already something that is not as safe as beer. Which was always the concern in Germany about dry hops.
Always been implied as being inherently a microbe inhibitor.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But they're not sterile and they don't inhibit that well. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I mean, they're very specific on what they inhibit, and you look across a broad range of pathogens, and that's not gonna help us.
Okay.
It helped us with certain bacteria,
Right.
so that was important in brewing, but not against the range of pathogens.
Just because it worked in the Middle Ages doesn't mean it works for NAs
Right.
in the modern world. Okay.
We originally tried to do these fermentations colder. And of course, with let's say making a Pilsner style, we also have a Pilsner recipe that we ferment at 10 C, 50 Fahrenheit. But we were trying years ago to ferment even the ales colder because it's not traditional ale yeast, right? We settled on higher fermentation temperatures. You got to be a little more careful because that can give you a little bit more alcohol over 0.5. But if you follow the mash schedule right, if you keep your other parts of your processes right, you can ferment. In our recipe we say it's ferment 20 to 24 because it's an easier fermentation at higher temperatures. But you can go lower. They do work at lower temperatures. We used Cervomyces, and that's a nutrient we've sold for a long time that has zinc. So somehow you got to get some zinc in there, whether it's Cervomyces or zinc sulfate.
It's not sufficient
heptahydrate.
from the malt, or just
It never is.
never is.
That's another topic. But anybody adding zinc in the hot side, it's gone. It goes with the whirlpool.
Yeah.
Because it chelates with protein, and that's what we're taking out of the whirlpool. So Cervomyces is protected from that as being in the yeast cell, but I think really cold, adding it with your yeast, adding zinc with your yeast is important. So either Cervomyces on the hot side or cold zinc on the cold side. And then let fermentation happen.
So just talk about that. Now, most of us are used to a vigorous fermentation.
Yes.
What would you expect?
Right. Well, because you're getting CO2 when you make ethanol.
Right.
Right. And if you're not making ethanol, you're not getting CO2. But that doesn't mean the microbes aren't doing anything. So the fermentation looks completely different. And again, you got to take your head out of the beer thing for a second and go like, that doesn't mean nothing's happening. Just like in the lag phase of a normal beer fermentation, before the CO2 comes up, it doesn't mean nothing's happening.
Right.
It's just the visuals that we're used to. All our fermentations over time, before current times, have been open. You can just look at it, whether you're a big brewery or a home brewer. Now there's more, stainless steel and everything, but so in a stainless steel fermenter, it might not look much different, but you're not going to see a bunch of bubbles of CO2.
It's going to look like a stuck fermentation.
Yes.
And how are you going to know it's not stuck?
Check the pH. Do some tastings,
It
but
should drop a little more.
pH will drop. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Even though you might have dropped it down to 4.6, it may drop further.
Correct.
Okay.
And so we, at a lot of breweries, I think, again, when you got a pH meter, you should just check your pH every day. We brewed an American lager yesterday here because this White Labs facility also has a brewery, White Labs Brewing Company, and the first thing I did this morning was to measure the pH.
Okay.
Yes, the bubbles are cool to see it's bubbling, but measure the pH.
Yeah.
And it's even more critical with this beer.
I got you. So don't expect any bubbles, and make sure you've dusted off that pH meter and she's good and calibrated.
Correct.
Because we're dealing with minute levels of pH, right?
Right. And it's a very low gravity beer, so when I talked about the malts we're using on this beer, we have this ingredient sheet, we have an example of one of the beers we made, and our starting gravity was 4.2. So everybody doesn't have to do that. You can use more malt than we have in this recipe, but I wouldn't go over 7 or 8.
Okay.
But 6 is good. We happen to do 4.2 here because you're not going to consume much of those carbohydrates. And so if you don't want a very carbohydrate-rich beer like they used to be, just unfermented wort pretty much, that's going to give you a lot of carbohydrates, carbs, and calories. So we just start low. And so it went from 4.2 to 3.4 over 8 days. We measured the alcohol by volume, and it was 0.34, so under the 0.5 to not be considered beer. IBUs were 25. And apparent attenuation, 16%. The most we really see is 20%.
Okay.
Starting pH was 4.2 on this beer, and it ended up at 4.1. So a modest change. And fermentation temperature, as I said, I think I said 20 C or 68 Fahrenheit.
Yeah, it's a real different mindset. I like what Josh Brewer said when I was talking to him earlier about a month ago. He said this beer begins where most beer end.
Yeah.
Which, this is kind of the mind shift, the pH side of things, the no activity from the outgassing of the CO2. I mean, we're back to, it's really a food product.
Yes. Yeah, it's a different product. It's a different mindset. It's a different safety standards. But more and more brewers are going to be making things like this that aren't beer, because consumers are drinking things like this, or spirits, or ciders, or things that haven't been invented yet that are non-beer. So, brewers get ready to have a lot of fun the next few years, getting creative and learning more food safety practices that we may not have been accustomed to.
So before we move on, can you explain maltose negative? I keep hearing that term in NA beers. It sounds essential for an NA yeast. Is it essential?
Yeah, I mean, not a lot of organisms or microbes, consume maltose. And brewer's yeast has a lot of multiplications in the genes to consume maltose that have been selected, not genetically made in the lab, but over time, long time ago, as these yeast brewers started using these yeasts, you would select yeast that would ferment drier, meaning we were selecting these mutants that could consume maltose better. Now we have to go back to the biological drawing board of nature and find yeasts that are not able to consume maltose. And there's lots of examples of those yeasts, but many of them make something that tastes like putrid, disgusting stuff, even if they're safe.
Yeah.
So trying to find organisms that make tasty flavors that weren't selected for that on purpose, as we did with brewer's yeast, is a much bigger challenge. And there are other microbes to come. I mean, there's still teams out in rainforests of Thailand and things searching for yeast, usually for the medical side of the world. But that's happening right now. That's happening all over the world. It's always happening. We're finding new species. So I think that's going to add to beers we're making and things that haven't been invented yet.
All right. Well, I do want to get to the rapid fire questions, but what would be your top tips as we kind of bring this all total? What would be your top tips for planning or refining or improving your NA brewing?
Keep doing it.
Practice.
Practice. Practice your recipes. Work on. Sanitation obviously is important. Bring pH into a daily monitoring system for yourself, and realize it's not just what you're adding to the beer as a potential contaminant. It's what may have never survived a boil, and that's a whole different mindset for us too. Doing pasteurization, which it's just, again, even there's contract breweries that don't have pasteurizers, and they're getting asked all the time, "Oh, can you do an NA beer for me?" So you're going to see some equipment changes in breweries too, as there's more interest here.
Because as far as you're concerned, if it's packaged, it better be pasteurized.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yes. Maybe we'll come up with something else in the future or whatever, but if you talk to most people in the food industry that it's not beer, there's only one answer, and it's yes. It needs to be pasteurized.
And what would those numbers be, just offhand, as a reference, at least for home brewers, for a pasteurization schedule? Is that the right word?
Right. So it's always about the temperature and time. So what we have in the recipe here is we put water bath because this was a homebrew recipe, so you can do this at home. You raise the temperature to 80 C, which is 176 Fahrenheit, and set the timer for 10 minutes. If you don't set a timer, if we didn't write set a timer for 10 minutes, I would say 15 minutes here.
Okay.
Because if you're just doing this, on your watch, you might go 5, right, or whatever. So set a timer or just think 15 minutes, and that'll give you the right number about pasteurization units.
Well, Chris, you're always a wealth of information, and really NA beers almost seems like advanced brewing. I really didn't realize. I thought it was kind of like beginner's brewing, but it really, I know one of the things when I was talking to Sierra Nevada and they were talking about what happens during pasteurization, and he said, oh, you got to be careful about DMS because guess what? That comes up. If diacetyl is a little in your beer, when you go through pasteurization, that's coming up. So, I mean, it's really like advanced brewing. So this is fantastic. I appreciate you lending our time to this. Now, I've got some rapid fire questions here that I would love to go through if you've got time for that.
Okay, yes, let's do that.
So, first question, and this comes from the audience. What are 2 great IPAs, one being NA, one being not?
Yes.
How would you contrast the profile?
I love IPAs. It's my favorite style. West Coast IPAs came in after I was in the industry. I mean, most people can't remember a craft beer industry without IPAs, but they used to be that way. And it was an exciting time when IPAs came around and brewers were making them and consumers were realizing how great they are. And so maybe we're going to experience that new thing now with IPAs, NA IPAs. It's where NA should go, because it's the most popular style. There's other styles too, but I think it also maybe with the hop levels can mask some of the NA non-beer things. Like when I first started making some NA beers and experiment with NA beers, I would bring it in our tasting room and do some sensories with the younger folks that work at White Labs or people that were there, and it was interesting to me that the terminology was not beer terminology. Lots of terminology like tea and other things. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this is why younger people are drinking these beers. They're not expecting or requiring it to taste like beer. I was coming from the standpoint of it's supposed to taste like beer. But that wasn't the case a year ago. But I think as more and more breweries are putting their attention on this, they're making things like this beer that tastes like beer. Because a good beer. Because and then a good beer. Because when you have what this current phase is, if I have an IPA and I have the IPAs, that's great. If I say I want NA beers today and I have NA beers that day, they're fine. They're different, but they're fine. Mm-hmm. But I found it sort of hard to have an IPA and then an NA IPA without it tasting weird.
Yeah.
Side by side. So I think this exact kind of evolution of brewing is going to allow people to say, the next one I'll have an NA.
Yeah.
And I think this is the first example I've really had that could not fool you, but taste interesting and good enough to go from one IPA to the next. And that's what I've been looking for.
Yeah.
Especially if you're driving or something, 2 7% IPAs.
That's a lot.
Yes.
Well, this one, boy, it would do very well in my book.
Yes.
So I think that's great. So what you're saying, I think, if it's a great NA IPA, while there are differences and it's hard to exactly pinpoint what they might be, they should taste very similar. There just may be some aspects of it that are different.
I think they should taste very similar.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we should shoot for. But you might, from a 50-year-old guy, get a different answer than a 20-year-old man or woman. But I think it's best for us to appeal to all the consumers to try to make them taste the same. And that's a great target for brewers.
Next rapid fire question. Can you use normal brewer's yeast? You know, let's say you just cut down on your grain bill, you do the high temperature mash. What happens if I throw a normal brewer's yeast in there?
Yeah, I went to a brewery in Austria that was combining their non-alcoholic beer with some of their normal Pilsner. But they were still, so they would blend. And I think blending could be something interesting here. They were just blending a little bit to get a little bit of those flavors, compounds from normal yeast.
Sounds smart.
And then they were still getting it under 0.5%.
But what if I just used, you know, instead of, you know, I showed the Lallemand yeast I used here. I'm trying that wherever I put it. You know, I think it is a brewer's yeast. Mm-hmm. What happens when you do that and you've got just a small grain bill?
You're going to make a low alcohol beer.
Okay.
You know, 1.5%, something like that. But it's not going to be below 0.5%.
Okay. That's where the difference comes in.
Right.
You can't get to that 0.5 otherwise.
Right. Now, maybe people will figure that out. Maybe they will do super low gravities. But then not much fermentation flavors are going to be made either. So I don't know. But there's probably a lot of room for experimenting there. But yeah, a normal. What I think might happen is maybe a rebirth of the low alcohol category in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, there's that exists in Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, but regulatory wise, but it just never got popular here. And so maybe sessions were still too high in alcohol. Maybe there is a room for a 1.5%.
There is in my book. I mean, I kind of look at it like you're buying gas.
Yeah.
I mean, you want certain times you want certain octanes.
Yes.
All right, our next one. Any recommendations for the malt or adjuncts for NA beer? Does your mindset change when you look at your grain bill?
You can use a lot more adjuncts. We tend to not want to use adjuncts in brewing. There are examples of 50% adjuncts, but 30% it could be sort of normal on an American Pilsner or different types of beers. But here you can use all sorts of adjuncts because you're just adding less maltose.
And should you use the adjuncts for like mouthfeel or body or things like that?
Yeah, I think that's where the creativity of brewers will come in, you know, different flake grains and things that, you can get and you might want to add.
Okay. So don't be afraid of them. That might be essential to making a good NA IPA.
Yes.
Or NA in general.
Good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Wish we had a good answer. But it's experimenting.
I see. Yeah. I mean, because again, you're trying to mash higher so you have less maltose, right? Well, use adjuncts, less maltose.
You've mentioned pH a number of times. You've also mentioned that pH is not magic, it's just important. Mm-hmm. So what are your tips in keeping the final pH in the food safe range?
Starting with it low, like we talked about in this recipe, realizing you're not going to get much change in the modest fermentation that happens. That's happening in fermentation because yeast make acids, but they have to grow to make the acids. And there's, you get some things that obviously in brewing our pH just after mashing is fairly low, but we got to go lower for this. So you just can't guess at it. You got to measure it.
Well, that's a perfect transition to the next question. I brought my little consumer grade meter, and I know when I was talking to John Palmer, and I'm not endorsing this, it just happens to be what I recently bought, but I kept asking John Palmer what to buy, and he said, well, here's what I'm using, and I said, well, I'm looking for more of a criteria, and he said, well, just don't buy one of those really super cheap ones. Spend $100. Actually, I got under $100, but I think this one seems pretty good. It has a replaceable tip, which in my mind was important because I hated to replace the whole meter if I didn't take care of the tip. What are you looking for? Is my $80 pH meter sufficient? What would you say?
Well, yeah, something too cheap would just be designed for water. And so, the pH meters are designed for wort are the best, your best choices. But look to spend money. This one looks very typical.
Yep.
And, you're going to take a sample and then put your pH meter in it.
Yeah, I could take it out, but one thing I liked about it had the whole, calibration kit. It's real easy to use. Again, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just trying to give people an idea of what the minimum is for a pH meter. So this one, you've got all the different calibrations. It also, has the 3M, was that HCl that you put in there. Mm-hmm. But seems to be a pretty sweet kit.
Yeah, it's got everything you need. You need to calibrate it.
Yeah.
So
is this sort of what you'd look for?
Yes, I'm glad you brought one.
Okay. But if you were going to, I'm not saying recommend, but this would be sort of what you would look for if you weren't going to spend the $500 or whatever it is to get a really nice one.
Yeah, because especially calibrating it on the low, pH 4, because that's the acidic side is where our fermentations lie. So.
Yeah, because I know I bought others and they didn't have the full range.
Right.
So this seems to be good, and I like the replaceable tip. So
Anyway,
so this might be okay. I'm not living dangerously home brewing my NA beer with a pH meter like this.
Yeah, that would work.
Okay, good. So we've talked about all these yeasts, but I've heard of something that I really don't particularly understand, but they called it NEM brewing, non-enzymatic brewing to get 1.5% beer. Is that anything you're familiar with?
People have been, experimenting with adding non-malted barley.
Yeah.
And that, it's not new. They were doing that in the 70s. They were experimenting with non-malted barley from a sustainability standpoint too. A lot less water involved in the brewing process if you don't have to malt the grain. But there was never the right flavor. That's what the old brewing chemists said at the time and stuff, that it didn't work for flavor. But it might work for some of your session or your low alcohol or your non-alcoholic beers. Because we don't need to generate that maltose, right?
Yeah.
Which we're going to generate later, but we have to malt it first to be able to make the enzymes to be able to make it in the mash, because everything's in that barley, and all you do is put in water, and then that malted barley, all you do is put in water, right? So it's like barley is pretty amazing. But we're malting it for a reason, so we can mash it. So I don't know. I would expect that what we're going to find is using certain proportions of non-malted barley is what people are going to do.
Yeah.
Because then you can use local barley. Only a small percentage of the world's barley gets malted, but you might have a farm next door that grows barley, and it's for feed or it's for feed usually. That's what we did on the farm that I grew up on. And it used to go to malt, but that malting plant moved away. So then it became feed for our cattle. But it would have been fun to brew with it.
Yeah, it sounds like it might be in one of your experiments coming up. All right, well, last question. But this lends itself to it because my understanding was this non-enzymatic brewing can get about a 1.5% beer. And I was talking to Crispy Fry, and we were looking at the BJCP competitions, and some of those specify like a German light beer might be as low as 2.5%. So the question comes in, at what point does the ABV kind of go below a protective threshold? Do you have any idea? Is it 2.5? Is it 2? Is it 1.5? Obviously, it's not 0.5 because we keep talking about the risk we're taking at 0.5.
Oh, I would treat all of these. I I would treat low alcohol beers as the same safety concerns as non-alcoholic. Yeah. I think I don't have a magic value for you, but I would.
As your experience, what would it be?
I would say under 3%.
Under 3. So you would look at it less as a beer and more as a food grade product if it's under 3%.
I would, yes.
Okay. All right. Well, no, that's all I'm looking for.
Even though that's not the regulatory side, as we explained, but I think from your brewing practices, yes.
All right. Well, Chris, this thing, NA Beer, when I got started, I really did not realize the can of worms that it really is. But it is just, it really made me appreciate how nearly magical beer is when you look at just how it cleans itself up and all of a sudden becomes this almost self-protecting beverage.
Right.
And when we brew NA beers, we just jerk the rug out of all those safety mechanisms.
Everything we've ever known. Because if we've only made beer, that seems like the world of information, right? So it's kind of fun that there's always more to learn. I'm learning things every single day. And this is another example that we can then drink what we've learned.
Well, cheers to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us.